There are places on the ocean where ships become tombs, where the sea refuses to give up its secrets, and where the last words of dying men echo across the decades like whispers from another world. The Strait of Malacca is such a place. Narrow, humid, pressed between the sweltering coasts of Sumatra and the Malay Peninsula, these waters have witnessed centuries of passage, of trade, of piracy, of storms that swallowed vessels whole and left nothing behind but floating debris and unanswered questions. But in the early months of 1947, something happened in these waters that defies the usual maritime explanations. Something that refuses simple categorization. Something that has haunted researchers, sailors, and investigators for over 7 decades. And it began not with a sighting, not with wreckage, not with survivors stumbling ashore with wild stories in their eyes. It began with a radio transmission, a voice, a series of words that would become among the most chilling ever recorded in maritime history. The message came through, broken, fragmented, cutting in and out against a wall of static. Yet what emerged from that static was unmistakable, clear enough, horrifying enough that every operator who heard it would remember it for the rest of their lives. All officers, including captain, are dead, lying in chart room and bridge, possibly whole crew dead. A pause, more static. And then, in letters that seem to emerge from some nightmare dimension, 2 final words that have never been adequately explained. I die. And then silence. Absolute, complete, impenetrable silence. The ship that sent this message was a Dutch freighter. Her name was the Ourang Medan. And what happened to her, to her crew, to the men whose bodies would be found frozen in postures of unimaginable terror, remains one of the most enduring mysteries of the 20th century. It is a mystery that touches on the physics of the possible, on the chemistry of death, on the geopolitics of a post-war world still smouldering with secrets. And it is a mystery that, despite decades of investigation, official inquiry and scholarly attention, has never been solved. To understand what happened to the Ourang Medan, one must first understand the world into which she sailed. The year was 1947. The great conflagration of the Second World War had ended barely 2 years prior. Europe lay in ruins. Japan had surrendered after the atomic fires of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had demonstrated to humanity exactly what horrors we were now capable of inflicting upon ourselves. The colonial powers that had once carved up Southeast Asia were attempting to reassert their authority over territories that had tasted, however briefly, something other than European rule. The Dutch, in particular, were struggling to maintain their grip on the sprawling archipelago of the Dutch East Indies, the vast collection of islands that would, in just a few short years, become the independent nation of Indonesia. This was a region in flux, a region of hidden agendas, of secret shipments, of cargoes that appeared on no manifest, of routes that wound through international waters to avoid the prying eyes of customs officials and newly empowered local governments. The Strait of Malacca, that narrow passage connecting the Indian Ocean to the South China Sea, was one of the most heavily trafficked shipping lanes on Earth. It remains so to this day. But in 1947, it was also a corridor of shadows. Vessels moved through these waters carrying goods that their captains would never discuss. Weapons left over from the war. Chemical agents whose existence was officially denied. Precious metals and gems smuggled out of territories whose ownership was contested. And perhaps, as some researchers have suggested, substances far more dangerous than any of these. The Ourang Medan was, by most accounts, a vessel of modest size and unremarkable appearance. Dutch registered, she plied the trade routes of Southeast Asia, carrying cargoes that her owners had contracted for and her crew had agreed to transport. The name itself offers a clue to her origins and her purpose. Ourang is a Malay word meaning man or person. Medan is a city in North Sumatra, Indonesia, one of the largest urban centres on that island, and a hub of trade and commerce that had served as a crucial node in the colonial economy for generations. The ship's name, then, translates roughly as Man of Medan, or Man from Medan, suggesting a vessel built or registered in that region, intended for service in those waters, perhaps owned by a trading company with roots in the Sumatran mercantile tradition. Yet here the mystery begins to deepen. Because when researchers in later years attempted to verify the existence of the Ourang Medan, to trace her registration, her construction, her ownership history, they found something deeply troubling. The records were incomplete. In some cases, the records did not exist at all, Lloyd's of London, the great maritime insurance registry that has documented ships and their fates since the 17th century, has no entry for a vessel by this name. The Dutch Shipping Register, which should have contained detailed information about any Dutch-flagged vessel operating in this period, offers similarly frustrating gaps. Some researchers have suggested that the ship was operating under false registration, that she was carrying a cargo so sensitive that her very existence had been scrubbed from the official record. Others have proposed that the name itself was a corruption, a mishearing or mistranslation that has sent investigators chasing a vessel that existed under a different designation entirely. But the absence of documentation does not mean the absence of the ship herself. Multiple contemporary accounts, including reports that appeared in Dutch and British newspapers in the months following the incident, describe what happened in terms too consistent, too detailed, too corroborated by multiple independent sources to be dismissed as mere fabrication. Something happened in the Strait of Malacca in early 1947, something that left a crew dead under circumstances that have never been explained. And the story of that something has been passed down through the decades, accumulating details and losing others, becoming the stuff of maritime legend while remaining anchored to a core of reported fact that resists easy dismissal. The sequence of events, as best it can be reconstructed from the available sources, began with that radio transmission. The exact date is disputed. Some accounts place it in February of 1947, others in June. The discrepancy itself is telling, suggesting that the official records, such as they were either poorly kept, deliberately obscured, or lost in the chaos of a region still rebuilding from war. What is consistent across the accounts is the nature of the message itself and the response it provoked. 2 ships are said to have received the distress call. The first was an American vessel, the Silver Star, which was also transiting the Strait of Malacca at the time. The second was a British ship whose name varies in different tellings of the story, but whose presence in the region is corroborated by shipping records of the period. Both vessels triangulated the origin of the transmission. Both altered course to render assistance, and both would find something that defied every expectation of what a maritime rescue should entail. The Silver Star reached the Ourang Medan first. The conditions were clear, the sea calm, the visibility excellent. This was not a case of a ship lost in fog, of a vessel battling a typhoon, of some natural disaster that could explain the catastrophe that had befallen her. The Ourang Medan lay upon the water like a thing already dead, her engines silent, her navigation lights extinguished, no smoke rising from her stack, no movement visible on her decks. She did not respond to signals. She did not acknowledge the approach of the Silver Star. She simply lay there, drifting, her hull intact, her structure sound, everything about her appearance suggesting a ship that should have been alive with activity, but which had instead become something else entirely. The boarding party was assembled from volunteers among the Silver Star's crew. These were experienced sailors, men who had seen the war, who had witnessed the aftermath of naval engagements, where ships had been torn apart by torpedoes and shells and mines. They had seen death at sea. They were not the sort to be easily frightened. Yet what they found when they climbed the ladder to the Ourang Medan's deck would haunt them for the remainder of their lives. Would, in the words of one account, leave them unable to speak for hours afterward. So profound was the horror of what they witnessed. The first body they encountered was on the main deck near the forecastle. A crewman, or what had been a crewman, lying on his back with his arms extended outward, his fingers curled as if grasping at something that was no longer there. His face was frozen in an expression of absolute terror, the mouth open, the eyes wide, every muscle tensed as if in the final moment of some unimaginable agony. But there was no visible wound, no blood, no sign of violence, of struggle, of any physical assault. The body simply lay there, unmarked, untouched, and yet so obviously a victim of something that had stopped his heart and fixed his features in that mask of fear. The boarding party moved deeper into the ship. They found more bodies, on the deck, in the corridors, in the crew quarters, in the engine room. Everywhere they looked, men lay dead, and every single one of them displayed the same characteristics, the same expressions of terror, the same grasping hands, the same lack of visible injury. It was as if some invisible wave had passed through the ship, stopping hearts, freezing faces, killing every living thing aboard in the span of a single terrible moment. They found the captain on the bridge. He lay near the wheel, his hand still reaching toward it as if he had died in the act of trying to steer his ship, to escape whatever horror had overtaken him. Near him lay the bodies of his officers, scattered across the chart room in postures of desperate flight that had achieved nothing. The radio operator was found in his cabin, slumped over the equipment he had used to send that final message, his hand still resting on the telegraph key, his lips parted as if the words "I die" had been the last sound to leave his body. But it was not only the human crew that had perished. The boarding party found the ship's dog, a loyal animal that had apparently accompanied the vessel on its voyages, lying dead on the deck. Its teeth were bared, its lips pulled back in a snarl as if it had died trying to defend itself against an enemy it could neither see nor fight. And like the men around it, it bore no mark of violence, no wound, no sign of any physical attack. The boarding party from the Silver Star searched the ship systematically, working their way through every compartment, every hold, every storage space. They opened hatches, they descended into the cargo holds, and here the accounts become more fragmentary, more disputed, more difficult to verify. Some versions of the story claim that the cargo holds were empty, that whatever the Ourang Medan had been carrying had vanished along with any explanation for the deaths of her crew. Other versions suggest that the holds contained drums, barrels, containers of some kind, though what these containers held is never specified. The most persistent rumour, one that has attached itself to the story and refuses to let go, is that the ship was carrying a cargo of potassium cyanide or some other highly toxic chemical agent, and that a leak from these containers had filled the ship with invisible death. This theory has a certain appeal. It would explain the absence of visible wounds. It would explain how an entire crew could die so quickly, so uniformly, without any apparent struggle. Cyanide interferes with cellular respiration, preventing the body from using oxygen even when oxygen is present. The effects are rapid, devastating, and can indeed produce the kind of agonal expressions that the boarding party described. A man dying of cyanide poisoning might well grasp at the air, might well contort his face in an expression that would be remembered as terror. Yet the cyanide theory has problems, significant problems. Problems that have led researchers to conclude that, while plausible on its surface, it cannot fully account for what was observed. For one thing, the boarding party from the Silver Star spent considerable time aboard the Ourang Medan. They searched the ship, they examined the bodies, they explored the cargo holds. If the ship had been filled with cyanide gas in concentration sufficient to kill the entire crew, the boarding party themselves should have been affected. They should have felt dizzy, nauseous, short of breath. They should have tasted the bitter almond scent that cyanide is said to produce, though this scent is only detectable by those with a particular genetic sensitivity. Instead, the accounts suggest that the boarding party experienced no ill effects whatsoever until much later, when some versions of the story claim that a fire broke out aboard the Ourang Medan, forcing them to abandon their investigation and return to the Silver Star. The fire. This is perhaps the strangest element of an already deeply strange story. According to most versions of the account, the boarding party had barely returned to their own vessel when smoke began to rise from the Ourang Medan's holds. Within minutes the smoke had become flames. Within hours the entire ship was engulfed. And then, in a final act of destruction that seemed almost deliberate, the Ourang Medan exploded. Her hull broke apart. Her superstructure collapsed into the sea. Whatever evidence she might have contained, whatever clues might have explained the fate of her crew, sank to the bottom of the Strait of Malacca and has never been recovered. Some researchers have seen in this fire and explosion the mark of conspiracy. A ship carrying a secret cargo, a cargo so dangerous or so damning that its discovery could not be allowed. A fire set deliberately to destroy the evidence, an explosion triggered by whatever volatile materials lay in her holds, ensuring that the truth would never be known. The timing, after all, is suspicious. The boarding party searches the ship. They find the bodies. They begin to investigate the cargo. And then, within moments of their departure, the ship catches fire and explodes. It is almost too convenient, too complete, too perfect a destruction. But fires aboard ships are not uncommon, particularly aboard vessels carrying industrial chemicals or other hazardous materials. The chaos of the boarding, the opening of hatches that had been sealed, the introduction of fresh air into compartments that had been oxygen deprived, could easily have triggered a chemical reaction. A spark from equipment disturbed during the search could have ignited fumes that had accumulated in the holds. The explosion itself could have been the result of containers bursting under the heat of the fire, releasing their contents in a final cataclysm. There is no need to invoke conspiracy to explain the destruction of the Ourang Medan, and yet, in the absence of any physical evidence, conspiracy remains as plausible as any other explanation. The ship took her secrets to the bottom, and there they remain. What, then, can we say about the fate of the Ourang Medan with any confidence? The truth is that we can say very little. The contemporary accounts, while consistent in their broad outlines, differ in their details. The physical evidence has been destroyed. The ship's documentation, if it ever existed, has been lost or suppressed. We are left with a story, a compelling story, a horrifying story. But a story nonetheless, filtered through decades of retelling, embellished by each new narrator, accumulating details that may or may not reflect what actually occurred in those waters in 1947. Yet the absence of definitive evidence does not mean the absence of meaning. Stories endure for reasons. They persist because they touch on something true, even if that truth is metaphorical rather than literal. And the story of the Ourang Medan touches on truths that remain deeply relevant to our understanding of the world. It touches first on the opacity of the post-war era. The years following World War II were a time of secrets. Governments had developed weapons of unimaginable destructive power and were now struggling to contain the knowledge of how those weapons were made. Chemical agents, biological weapons, nuclear materials moved through unofficial channels, transported by ships that appeared on no manifest, crewed by men who asked no questions. The Ourang Medan, whether she actually existed or not, represents this shadow world. She is the ship that carried the cargo that could not be named. She is the vessel that sailed the routes that did not officially exist. And her fate, whatever it actually was, reminds us that the official record of history is always incomplete, always partial, always shaped by what those in power choose to reveal and what they choose to hide. It touches, second, on the fundamental mystery of death at sea. The ocean is vast, it is indifferent. It does not care about the ships that cross its surface or the crews that man them. It swallows vessels whole and leaves no trace. It preserves bodies for decades or consumes them in hours. It creates conditions that no laboratory can replicate and no experiment can predict. The Ourang Medan is a reminder that the sea remains, despite all our technology, despite all our knowledge, a place where things happen that we cannot explain, where men die in ways that defy our understanding, where the ordinary rules of cause and effect seem suspended, replaced by something older, stranger, more resistant to rational analysis. And it touches, third, on the limits of human understanding itself. We want explanations. We need them. Our minds rebel against the unexplained, the unresolved, the mystery that remains mysterious. We generate theories, we propose solutions, we construct narratives that make sense of the senseless. The cyanide theory, the conspiracy theory, the theory of a shared hallucination aboard the Silver Star, a mass delusion that caused the boarding party to see bodies that were not there, to imagine a horror that never occurred. Each of these theories has its advocates. Each of them addresses some aspect of the evidence, while failing to account for others, and none of them finally can be proven or disproven. The mystery remains. It will likely remain forever. This is not satisfying. We want answers. We deserve them. But the universe is not obligated to provide what we want or deserve. Sometimes the truth is simply lost. Sometimes the evidence is destroyed. Sometimes the witnesses die before they can tell what they saw, or they survive but find that no one believes them, or they choose to remain silent because what they experienced was too strange, too terrible, too far outside the bounds of normal experience to be shared. The boarding party from the Silver Star returned to their ship. They reported what they had seen. Their accounts were relayed through official channels, recorded in documents that have since been lost or destroyed, picked up by newspapers that published abbreviated versions of the story, before moving on to other sensations. And then the Ourang Medan exploded and sank, taking with her whatever chance there might have been to understand what had killed her crew. But the story did not die. Stories rarely do, when they touch on something profound. The tale of the Ourang Medan was passed from sailor to sailor, from port to port, from generation to generation. It appeared in collections of maritime mysteries. It was investigated by researchers who found themselves frustrated by the absence of documentation, The inconsistencies in the accounts, the impossibility of verifying what had actually occurred. It was debunked and rehabilitated, dismissed as a hoax, and defended as genuine, subjected to the full range of interpretive approaches that humanity applies to its unsolved mysteries. And throughout all of this, the central questions remained unanswered. What killed the crew of the Ourang Medan? Why were their faces frozen in expressions of terror? What were they carrying in those holds that burned and exploded, destroying any chance of a definitive answer? Who were these men, these Dutch sailors on a vessel with a Malay name, operating in waters where the colonial order was collapsing and a new world was struggling to be born? What did they see in their final moments? What did they feel? What made the radio operator, in the last extremity of his life, tap out those two final words that have echoed across the decades? I die. What was he trying to communicate? Was it simply a statement of fact, a final acknowledgement that his life was ending? Or was it something more? A warning, perhaps? A plea? A desperate attempt to convey to anyone who might be listening that something had gone terribly wrong aboard his ship, something that could not be explained in the moments remaining to him, something that he hoped others might understand even if he could not. We will never know. The Ourang Medan has taken her secrets to the bottom of the Strait of Malacca, where they lie among the silt and the coral and the bones of all the other ships that have found their final rest in those waters. But the questions remain. They hover over the surface of the sea like mist, like the last traces of smoke from a fire that burned out long ago. They whisper to anyone who pauses to listen. They remind us that the world is larger than our understanding, that history contains pockets of darkness that no amount of research can illuminate, that there are places and times where something happens that we cannot explain and perhaps never will. Standing at the edge of knowledge, looking out over the vast expanse of what we do not know, one cannot help but feel a certain humility. The ocean does not care about our need for answers. The dead do not rise to tell their stories. The ships that sink do not resurface to reveal what happened in their final hours. We are left with fragments, rumours, second-hand accounts of events that may or may not have occurred as described, and we are left with the irresistible human compulsion to make sense of these fragments, to construct narratives that explain the inexplicable, to fill the gaps in our knowledge with theories and speculations that may bring us closer to the truth or may lead us further from it. The story of the Ourang Medan is such a fragment. It is a piece of a larger puzzle that we will never complete. It is a window into a world that no longer exists, a world of post-war chaos and colonial collapse, of secret cargoes and hidden agendas, of ships that sailed into the unknown and never returned, and it is a reminder that the sea keeps its secrets well, that some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, that the line between what we know and what we can never know is drawn not by our intelligence or our technology, but by the fundamental limits of human understanding in the face of an indifferent universe. The Strait of Malacca flows on. Ships pass through its waters every day, thousands of them, carrying cargoes that would have been unimaginable in 1947. Container ships and tankers and bulk carriers, their movements tracked by satellite, their positions known to the minute, their cargoes documented in databases accessible from anywhere on Earth. The age of mystery shipping, of vessels that operated in the shadows, of cargoes that appeared on no manifest seems to have passed. And yet, the sea remains what it has always been. Vast, deep, unknowable. A place where things happen that are never recorded, never explained, never understood. Somewhere beneath those waters, in the darkness where the light never reaches, the wreckage of the Ourang Medan may still lie. Her hull collapsed, her superstructure scattered across the seafloor, her cargo, whatever it was, long since dispersed or decomposed or absorbed into the sediment, and with her the bodies of her crew, the captain who died at the wheel, the officers who lay scattered across the chart room, the radio operator who sent that final message, the dog that died with its teeth bared against an enemy it could not see. They are all there, in the darkness, waiting. Not waiting for rescue is no longer possible. Not waiting for discovery, for the depths of the Strait of Malacca have never been systematically surveyed, and the chance of finding a single small freighter among the countless wrecks that litter those waters is vanishingly small. They are waiting, perhaps only for remembrance, for someone to pause to consider their fate, to wonder what happened to them in those final terrible moments, and to acknowledge that their deaths, however inexplicable, were real, that they lived, that they sailed, that they died, and that their story, incomplete as it is, fragmented as it is, surrounded by uncertainties and contradictions as it is, remains one of the most haunting tales ever to emerge from the sea. The waters of the Strait of Malacca keep their secrets. The dead tell no tales, but the questions persist. They hover over the waves like the ghosts of those who died aboard that silent ship, that tomb adrift on the current, that vessel whose very existence remains disputed, but whose story has touched something deep in the human imagination. What killed them? How did they die? Why were their faces frozen in expressions of such profound terror? What cargo did they carry, and what connection, if any, did it have to their fate? These are the questions that draw us into the mystery of the Ourang Medan. These are the threads that we will follow as we attempt to reconstruct what happened in those waters in 1947, to separate fact from legend, evidence from speculation, the possible from the impossible. It is a journey that will take us through the archives of maritime history, through the laboratories of forensic science, through the geopolitical complexities of a post-war world that is only now beginning to reveal its secrets. And it is a journey that will bring us again and again to the same uncomfortable conclusion, that some mysteries resist solution, that some questions have no answers, that the Ourang Medan, whatever she was, wherever she lies, has taken the truth about her final voyage to a place we cannot follow. But we will try, we must try, because the dead deserve our attention, even when they cannot speak for themselves, because the story demands to be told, even when the telling raises more questions than it answers, and because somewhere in the darkness of the Strait of Malacca, a ship lies silent, her crew still frozen in their final moments, waiting for someone to remember them. Let us begin. The first challenge confronting anyone who attempts to investigate the Ourang Medan is the most fundamental one imaginable. Did the ship exist at all? This question, which might seem almost absurd when posed about a vessel whose story has circulated for nearly 8 decades, is in fact the starting point for any serious inquiry into the mystery. Ships are not phantoms. They are constructed in shipyards. They are registered with maritime authorities. They are insured by underwriters. They are owned by companies or individuals whose names appear in official records. They are crewed by sailors whose names are entered into logbooks, whose wages are recorded, whose families know when they depart and expect them to return. Ships leave trails of documentation, paper contrails that mark their passage through the world of commerce and regulation and bureaucratic oversight. And yet the Ourang Medan appears in none of these records. Or rather, she appears in so few of them, and those so fragmentary, that her very existence becomes a matter of debate rather than established fact. The search for the Ourang Medan in official records has occupied researchers for decades. Maritime historians have combed through the archives of Lloyd's of London, that venerable institution that has insured ships and their cargoes since the 17th century, and whose records constitute one of the most comprehensive databases of maritime activity ever compiled. They have searched the registers of the International Maritime Organization and its predecessor bodies. They have examined the shipping records of the Netherlands, under whose flag the vessel allegedly sailed. They have consulted the port authorities of Singapore and the coastal cities of the Dutch East Indies. They have reviewed the casualty reports maintained by maritime insurance companies, reports that meticulously document every significant loss at sea. And in all of these archives, in all of these registries, in all of these carefully maintained records of the comings and goings of the world's merchant fleets, the Ourang Medan does not appear. Her name is absent from the lists of registered vessels. Her loss is not recorded among the maritime casualties of 1947 or 1948. Her owners, whoever they may have been, left no trace in the annals of shipping commerce. This absence is, in itself, extraordinary. The immediate post-war period was not the chaotic frontier of maritime activity that one might imagine. The shipping industry had endured 6 years of global conflict, years in which submarines and aircraft and mines had sent thousands of vessels to the bottom, years in which the merchant marines of the warring nations had suffered catastrophic losses. In the aftermath of that conflict, the maritime authorities were particularly vigilant about registration and documentation. Ships were valuable assets in a world desperately short of transport capacity. Insurance rates were carefully calculated based on accurate assessments of risk. The movement of cargoes, especially sensitive cargoes, was monitored with unprecedented attention. For a ship of any size to operate in these waters without appearing in any official record would require deliberate effort, deliberate concealment. Some researchers have suggested that the Ourang Medan may have been registered under a different name, that she may have been operating under a flag of convenience, that her owners may have deliberately obscured her identity for reasons of their own. This is not as implausible as it might sound. The practice of registering ships under flags of convenience, using the registration systems of countries with lax maritime regulations to avoid the stricter requirements of more developed nations, was well established by the late 1940s. Panama, Liberia and Honduras all offered ship registration services that asked few questions and imposed minimal oversight. A vessel wishing to operate outside the normal channels of maritime commerce might easily have taken advantage of such arrangements. But even flags of convenience leave records. Even Panama and Liberia maintained registries, incomplete though they may have been, and the Ourang Medan appears in none of them. The Netherlands Maritime Authority, which would have been the natural place to register a Dutch vessel operating in the East Indies, has no record of any ship by that name. The colonial administration of the Dutch East Indies, which maintained its own shipping records throughout the pre-war period and into the chaotic transitional years following Japanese occupation, likewise contains no mention of her. The British authorities in Singapore and Malaya, who controlled the western approaches to the Strait of Malacca and maintained detailed logs of vessel movements through those waters, have no record of a distress call from a ship called Ourang Medan, no record of a rescue operation, no record of any incident matching the described events. The United States Coast Guard, whose cutter Silver Star is identified in some accounts as the rescue vessel, has no record of any such operation in its files for 1947 or 1948. The name Ourang Medan does not appear in the Coast Guard's official history, in its operational logs, in the personal papers of any officer who served in those waters during that period. This documentary void has led some researchers to conclude, reasonably enough, that the entire story is a fabrication, a maritime urban legend, a tale that grew in the telling, that acquired details and embellishments as it passed from one storyteller to another, but that had no foundation in actual events. This interpretation has the advantage of simplicity. It explains the absence of records by positing that there were no events to record. It explains the lack of physical evidence by suggesting that there was no wreck to leave evidence. It treats the Ourang Medan not as a historical mystery to be solved, but as a folk narrative to be analysed, a story whose meaning lies not in its factual accuracy, but in its symbolic resonance, in the fears and anxieties it expresses about the sea and its dangers, about the fragility of human life in the face of natural forces, about the boundaries between the known and the unknown. But this interpretation, persuasive as it might be, encounters its own difficulties. Stories do not emerge from nothing. Urban legends, maritime or otherwise, typically have some kernel of origin, some actual event or observation that serves as the seed from which the legend grows. The legend of the Flying Dutchman, that most famous of all ghost ship stories, may be pure fiction, but it arose in the context of real maritime anxieties, real encounters with optical illusions and storms, and the peculiar atmospheric conditions of the Cape of Good Hope. The legend of the Mary Celeste is surrounded by myth and embellishment, but at its core lies a real ship and a real event, a mystery that has never been satisfactorily explained. Even the most fantastic maritime tales tend to have some connection to documented reality, some anchor in the world of verifiable fact. And the Ourang Medan story, despite its folkloric qualities, does have such anchors. They are slender, to be sure. They are fragmentary and contradictory, but they exist. The earliest documented reference to the Ourang Medan incident appears in a series of articles published in 1948 in the Nederlandse Zeevaartkrant, a Dutch maritime newspaper. These articles, which appeared over 3 consecutive issues in February of that year, described the discovery of a drifting vessel in the Strait of Malacca, the recovery of the ship by nearby vessels responding to a distress call, and the horrifying condition of the crew. The articles contained many of the details that would become familiar elements of the legend. The distress call with its cryptic message, the bodies scattered across the deck and in the interior compartments, the expressions of terror frozen on the faces of the dead, the dog found dead with its teeth bared, the mysterious explosion that destroyed the ship before a proper investigation could be conducted. The articles were unsigned, as was common practice in Dutch newspapers of that era, and the sources cited were vague. References were made to unnamed salvage personnel, and unnamed Dutch officials and unnamed witnesses whose testimony could not be independently verified. But the articles were published in a legitimate newspaper, a publication with a readership among maritime professionals who would have been in a position to recognise obvious fabrications. This is not proof that the events described actually occurred, but it is evidence that the story was circulating in detailed form within a year of the alleged incident. Further documentation emerged in 1952, when the CIA officer and prolific author of books on unexplained phenomena, Maurice K. Jessup, included an account of the Ourang Medan in his book on unidentified flying objects. Jessup's version of the story, which he claimed to have obtained from confidential sources, added new details to the narrative. He placed the incident specifically in February 1948, a date that conflicts with the 1947 date given in most other accounts. He identified the rescuing vessel not as the Silver Star, but as a different American ship, whose name he did not disclose. He suggested that the crew had been killed by exposure to an unknown form of radiation, a claim that reflected the anxieties of the early atomic age, but that found no support in any contemporary source. Jessup was not a reliable narrator. His books on unexplained phenomena were filled with speculation and unsupported assertions, and his sources were often impossible to verify. But his account does demonstrate that the Ourang Medan story had crossed from Dutch maritime circles into the broader world of unexplained mysteries by the early 1950s, acquiring new elements and interpretations as it travelled. The most detailed early account of the incident appeared in 1953 in a publication of the Merchant Marine Council of the United States Coast Guard. This account, which appeared in the proceedings of a maritime safety conference, described the Ourang Medan incident as a cautionary tale about the dangers of improper cargo handling. The account identified the source of the crew's deaths as a cargo of potassium cyanide and nitroglycerin, improperly stored and inadequately ventilated, which had released toxic fumes into the enclosed spaces of the ship. The account was presented not as speculation but as established fact, as an example of the kind of accident that could occur when proper safety procedures were not followed. And yet the author of this account cited no sources, no investigation report, no testimony from survivors or witnesses, no documentation of any kind that would allow the claims to be verified. The Merchant Marine Council publication was a semi-official document, produced under the auspices of a government agency, and its inclusion of the Ourang Medan story lent a certain credibility to the tale. But the account was based, as far as can be determined, on the same unverifiable sources that had fed the earlier newspaper articles and popular accounts. What are we to make of this pattern? We have a story that appeared, fully formed and richly detailed, in a maritime newspaper in 1948. We have subsequent accounts that elaborated on the story, adding new elements and new interpretations, but that cited no primary sources and produced no documentary evidence. We have an official or semi-official account that treated the story as established fact, but that provided no more verification than the popular accounts. And we have an absolute absence of the kind of documentation that would normally attend any maritime incident of this magnitude. No insurance claims, no investigation reports, no court of inquiry, no entries in the casualty registers, no death certificates for the crew, no records of any kind in the archives of the governments and institutions that would normally have been involved. One explanation for this pattern is that the story is indeed a fabrication, a tale that was invented whole cloth and then gained credibility through repetition, through publication in increasingly authoritative-seeming sources, through the human tendency to treat printed accounts as more reliable than oral tradition. This explanation is consistent with the evidence. It accounts for the documentary void. It explains why the story has resisted verification despite decades of searching. It is in many ways the most parsimonious interpretation of the available data. But there is another explanation, one that cannot be dismissed as readily as skeptics might wish. It is an explanation that emerges not from the realm of supernatural speculation, but from the very earthly context of post-war geopolitics and covert operations. The Dutch East Indies of 1947 was a region in profound turmoil. The Japanese occupation, which had lasted from 1942 to 1945, had shattered the colonial order that the Dutch had maintained for more than 3 centuries. The Indonesian nationalist movement, which had declared independence in August 1945, was engaged in an armed struggle against Dutch attempts to reassert colonial control. The conflict was brutal on both sides, the Dutch deployed some 100,000 troops in an effort to suppress the independence movement. The Indonesian forces, outgunned but fighting on familiar terrain, waged a guerrilla campaign that denied the Dutch any lasting control over the territory they nominally administered. The British, who had accepted the Japanese surrender in the region, found themselves drawn into the conflict as well, using Indian Army troops to maintain order in the chaotic period before Dutch forces could arrive in strength. The United States, though officially neutral, was deeply involved behind the scenes, pressuring both sides toward negotiation while pursuing its own strategic interests in a region of obvious importance to the emerging Cold War order. In this context of conflict and chaos, the movement of sensitive materials through the region was a matter of intense interest to multiple parties. The Japanese, during their occupation, had conducted extensive chemical and biological weapons research, some of it in facilities located in the Dutch East Indies. The Americans, who had captured much of Japan's chemical weapons stockpile at the end of the war, were keenly interested in preventing such materials from falling into the hands of the Soviets or the Chinese communists. The Dutch, anxious to restore their colonial economy, were equally anxious to recover valuable industrial assets that the Japanese had appropriated during the occupation. And various private actors, some of them operating with government sanction and others entirely on their own account, saw opportunity in the chaos, the chance to acquire and move materials of value without the inconvenient oversight of legitimate authorities. Chemical weapons, in particular, occupied a peculiar position in this post-war landscape. The Geneva Protocol of 1925 had prohibited the use of chemical and biological weapons in warfare, but it had not prohibited their production or stockpiling. Most of the major powers had maintained substantial chemical weapons programs throughout the interwar period and had expanded them dramatically during World War II. At the war's end, vast quantities of chemical munitions existed in arsenals around the world, and their disposal posed a significant challenge. Some were dumped at sea, creating contamination problems that persist to this day. Some were destroyed through controlled incineration, and some, inevitably, found their way into less official channels. The hypothesis that the Ourang Medan was carrying a cargo of chemical weapons, illicit or otherwise, is not new. It has been proposed repeatedly by researchers seeking to explain both the deaths of the crew and the absence of documentation. The scenario typically proposed runs something as follows. A ship, operating outside normal channels, is engaged to transport a cargo of chemical munitions from some point of origin, perhaps a former Japanese facility, to some unknown destination. The cargo is improperly stored or begins to leak during the voyage. The crew, exposed to toxic fumes, succumbs rapidly, the poison working so quickly that there is no time to abandon ship, no time even to don protective equipment. The ship drifts, unmanned, until discovered by a passing vessel. The rescuers board, find the crew dead, and retreat in horror. Before any investigation can be conducted, the ship catches fire, perhaps due to the instability of the cargo itself, and sinks, taking the evidence with her. The governments and agencies that might have investigated choose not to, either because they are complicit in the original operation, or because they prefer not to draw attention to the movement of prohibited materials through the region. The documentary void is thus explained not by the non-existence of the event, but by its deliberate erasure. This hypothesis is attractive in many ways. It accounts for the physical evidence such as we have it. Exposure to certain chemical agents can indeed cause death with remarkable speed. Hydrogen cyanide, phosgene, and various organophosphate compounds can kill within minutes of exposure, and the symptoms of such poisoning, the rictus, the distorted features, the frozen expressions, might well be interpreted as expressions of terror by those unfamiliar with the medical effects. The hypothesis accounts for the fire and explosion. Chemical munitions, particularly those manufactured under wartime conditions with less than perfect quality control, are notoriously unstable. Leaking containers, exposed to air and heat, could easily ignite, and the hypothesis accounts for the documentary void, explaining it as the result of deliberate suppression rather than simple non-occurrence. But the hypothesis also has significant weaknesses. It requires us to assume a coordinated cover-up involving multiple governments and agencies, a cover-up that has remained unbroken for nearly 8 decades. Cover-ups of this magnitude are not impossible, but they are rare. Secrets have a way of leaking. Documents surface. Participants grow old and garrulous. archival researchers digging through unrelated materials stumble upon unexpected connections. The intelligence agencies that might have been involved in such an operation in 1947 have been the subject of intense scrutiny ever since, their files combed by historians and journalists and congressional investigators. The archives of the CIA and the British intelligence services have been partially declassified. The records of the Dutch colonial administration have been extensively studied, and none of this scrutiny has produced any documentary confirmation of the chemical weapons hypothesis. No shipping manifests, no operational orders, no correspondence between officials, no intelligence assessments, nothing that would corroborate the theory beyond the logic of its construction. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, as the saying goes, but in this case, the absence is so complete, so thoroughgoing, that it strains credulity to imagine that the evidence ever existed. Cover-ups leave traces, secret operations produce paperwork, even when the operators intend to destroy it. The machinery of bureaucracy, once set in motion, cannot be stopped by mere intention. Somewhere, one would think, a reference would survive, a code name in a budget document, an oblique mention in a diplomat's diary, a passing reference in an intercepted communication, something, anything, and yet there is nothing. The Ourang Medan exists in a curious liminal space, suspended between fact and legend, between documented history and maritime folklore. She cannot be proven to have existed, because the records that would prove her existence have either never existed, or have been so thoroughly destroyed that no trace remains. But she cannot be definitively proven not to have existed either, because the absence of records, while suggestive, is not conclusive. Ships have been lost without trace before. Records have been destroyed, sometimes deliberately, sometimes through the ordinary attrition of time and neglect. The chaos of the post-war period, the political sensitivities of the region, the fragmented nature of the colonial administration in its final years, all of these factors make it at least conceivable that a ship could have operated and died without leaving any documentary footprint. What we are left with, then, is a choice. We can choose to believe that the Ourang Medan never existed, that the entire story is a fabrication or a hoax, or a piece of maritime folklore that somehow acquired the trappings of documented fact. This interpretation is intellectually defensible. It is consistent with the evidence, or rather with the lack of evidence. It does not require us to invoke conspiracies or cover-ups or deliberate suppression. It simply asks us to accept that a good story, well told, can take on a life of its own, can be repeated and embellished and eventually come to be treated as history, even when it has no historical foundation. Or we can choose to believe that something happened in the Strait of Malacca in 1947. Something terrible and unexplained. Something that left a crew dead and a ship adrift and a story that would not die. This interpretation requires us to accept uncertainties. It requires us to acknowledge that the evidence is fragmentary and unreliable, that the documentary record is silent, that we may never know with certainty what occurred. But it also acknowledges something that the skeptical interpretation tends to overlook, that the story persists, that it has resonated across decades and cultures, that it speaks to something deep in the human experience of the sea, something that cannot be easily dismissed as mere credulity or entertainment. The truth, whatever it may be, lies somewhere in the depths of the Strait of Malacca. Perhaps it lies with the wreckage of a ship that never officially existed, her hull collapsed, her secrets preserved in the sediment of the seafloor. Perhaps it lies only in the collective imagination of those who have told and retold her story, each teller adding something of their own, each listener carrying away something different. Perhaps the truth is that there is no single truth, that the Ourang Medan is both real and unreal, both historical event and cultural artifact, both tragedy and tall tale. What we can say with certainty is that the questions remain. They have resisted 8 decades of investigation and speculation and analysis. They have outlived the witnesses, if there ever were witnesses. They have outlived the investigators, if there ever were investigators. They have become part of the permanent furniture of maritime mystery, as fixed and familiar as the Flying Dutchman or the Mary Celeste. And they continue to draw us in, to demand our attention, to insist that we try, however futilely, to understand. The waters of the Strait of Malacca are busy today, busier than they have ever been. Hundreds of ships pass through each day, their courses tracked by satellite, their cargoes documented in electronic databases, their movements visible to anyone with access to the appropriate tracking systems. The age of mystery shipping, of vessels that move through the world unseen and unrecorded, seems to have ended. The sea has been tamed, or at least surveilled. The shadows have been illuminated. The unknowns have been catalogued and classified and explained. And yet the old mysteries persist. They drift on the currents of memory and imagination, refusing to sink, refusing to be forgotten, refusing to yield their secrets to the light of modern scrutiny. The Ourang Medan is among them. She is there, somewhere, in the darkness beneath the waves, or in the darkness of the collective unconscious, waiting for someone to remember her, to speak her name, to wonder once more about the fate of her crew and the meaning of their deaths. The physical evidence, such as it is, offers few certainties, but there are theories, hypotheses that attempt to explain what might have killed those men, in ways that do not require us to invoke the supernatural or the impossible. These theories deserve examination, not because they can solve the mystery, but because they illuminate its contours, because they show us the range of possibilities within which the truth, whatever it may be, must lie. The most commonly proposed explanation for the deaths aboard the Ourang Medan, the one that appears most frequently in discussions of the case, involves cargo. Specifically, it involves dangerous cargo, materials that were never meant to be carried aboard a civilian freighter, substances so hazardous that their very presence aboard a ship would constitute a crime under maritime law and international treaty. This theory suggests that the Ourang Medan was engaged in the clandestine transport of chemical weapons, nerve agents or other toxic compounds left over from the Second World War, materials that the official channels of demilitarization had failed to account for or that had been diverted into the shadowy networks of post-war smuggling. The historical context makes this hypothesis less outlandish than it might initially appear. The Second World War had seen the production of chemical weapons on an industrial scale. All major combatants had manufactured and stockpiled vast quantities of nerve agents, mustard gas, phosgene, and other compounds designed to incapacitate and kill. Japan, in particular, had maintained extensive chemical weapons programs throughout its occupation of Southeast Asia. When the war ended, much of this material remained. Some was destroyed under Allied supervision. Some was dumped at sea, creating underwater time bombs that continue to leak toxins into the marine environment to this day. And some, according to various historical accounts, simply disappeared. It vanished into the chaos of post-war Asia, into the hands of warlords and smugglers and opportunists who saw value in possessing the most terrible weapons humanity had yet devised. The Strait of Malacca, in 1947, would have been an ideal route for such contraband. The region was in turmoil, colonial empires were collapsing, new nations were struggling to assert sovereignty over territories that had been occupied, traded and fought over for centuries. The Indonesian War of Independence was raging. The Malayan emergency would soon begin. China was sliding towards civil war. In such an environment, the normal mechanisms of law enforcement and customs inspection were hopelessly inadequate. Ships could move through the region carrying almost anything, their cargoes unexamined, their destinations unquestioned, their very existence unrecorded in any official ledger. If the Ourang Medan was carrying chemical weapons, the theory continues, something went wrong with the containment. Perhaps the holds were inadequately ventilated, perhaps the containers leaked, perhaps the tropical heat accelerated some chemical reaction that would have been stable in a cooler climate. The agents would have dispersed through the ship invisibly, carried on the air currents that flowed through corridors and companionways, seeping into every compartment, filling the lungs of every man aboard. Death would have come quickly, perhaps within minutes, too fast for the crew to don gas masks or flee to the deck, too fast for anyone to do more than send a desperate fragmentary distress signal before the poison overwhelmed them. This theory explains the expressions of terror that are said to have marked the faces of the dead. Nerve agents in particular cause horrific symptoms in their final stages. The facial muscles contort, the body convulses, the eyes bulge. A victim of nerve agent exposure does not die peacefully. He dies in agony, and that agony is written on his features, preserved in death as a kind of final testimony to his suffering. The theory explains why the boarding party found no obvious signs of violence, no wounds or injuries that would indicate attack or struggle. Chemical agents leave no external marks. They kill from within, disrupting the nervous system, paralyzing the muscles that control breathing, stopping the heart. The body remains intact, superficially undamaged, even as the person inside dies in the most terrible way imaginable. The theory also offers an explanation for the fire and explosion that supposedly destroyed the Ourang Medan shortly after the boarding party withdrew. Many chemical agents are unstable. They can ignite under certain conditions, can react with seawater or with other compounds in unpredictable ways, can generate heat and pressure that build until containment fails and conflagration ensues. If the holds were filled with leaking containers of chemical weapons, the ship would have been a floating bomb, waiting for some chance spark or chemical reaction to set it off. The boarding party in this reading was fortunate to escape with their lives. A few more minutes aboard, and they too might have been caught in the explosion, their bodies scattered across the strait along with the remains of the crew and the deadly cargo. The chemical weapons theory is compelling. It provides a unified explanation for the strange details of the story. It connects the mystery to the broader historical context of post-war Asia. It does not require us to invoke supernatural forces or unknown phenomena. It relies only on substances and technologies that we know existed, on smuggling networks that we know operated in the region, on the chaos and lawlessness that we know characterized the immediate post-war period. In many ways, it is the most rational explanation available, the one that demands the fewest assumptions and the least departure from established fact. And yet the theory has problems, significant problems, problems that undermine its explanatory power, even as they underscore the difficulty of understanding what might have happened to the Ourang Medan. The first problem is the lack of documentation. If chemical weapons were being smuggled through the Strait of Malacca in 1947, someone, somewhere, should have noticed. Allied forces were actively working to locate and destroy Japanese chemical weapon stockpiles. Intelligence services were monitoring smuggling networks. Naval patrols were watching the shipping lanes. The idea that a cargo of nerve agents could simply disappear from military stockpiles, be loaded onto a freighter and transported across international waters without leaving any trace in the documentary record strains credulity. This does not mean it could not have happened. Stranger things have occurred in the chaos of collapsing empires, but the complete absence of any corroborating evidence, any record of missing chemical weapons, any intelligence report about suspicious cargo, any naval communication about unidentified vessels, makes the theory difficult to verify. The second problem is technical. Chemical weapons, particularly nerve agents, are extremely dangerous. They are designed to kill quickly and efficiently, but they also disperse. They break down. They lose potency over time and under certain environmental conditions. The idea that a cargo of chemical weapons would release enough agent to kill an entire crew simultaneously, without any warning, without giving anyone time to escape or take countermeasures, requires a very specific set of circumstances. The containers would need to have failed catastrophically. The ventilation would need to have spread the agent throughout the ship almost instantaneously. The concentration would need to have been lethal from the first breath. This is possible. Chemical weapons can behave this way under certain conditions, but it is not automatic. It requires a kind of perfect storm of containment failure and atmospheric dispersion that is difficult to achieve even intentionally. The third problem is the expressions of terror. This detail is central to the legend. It is what makes the story memorable and haunting. But it is also medically questionable. Nerve agents do cause facial contortion, but the mechanism is muscle spasm, not emotional expression. A victim of nerve agent poisoning does not necessarily look frightened. He looks distorted, twisted, the facial muscles locked in positions that reflect the chaos of his nervous system, not the contents of his mind. The idea that the crew of the Ourang Medan were frozen in expressions of fear, their features preserving the horror of their final moments, speaks more to the narrative conventions of ghost stories than to the clinical realities of chemical weapons exposure. This does not mean the story is false. It may be that the early tellers of the tale, perhaps unfamiliar with the precise effects of nerve agents, interpreted the contorted faces of the victims as expressions of terror. It may be that the detail was added later, embroidered onto the story to make it more compelling, more horrific, more memorable. But it suggests that the account we have received may not be an accurate description of what a witness would actually have seen. The fourth problem is the ship itself. If the Ourang Medan was carrying chemical weapons, she was engaged in an activity so illegal, so dangerous, so offensive to international norms that everyone involved would have had powerful incentives to keep it secret. The crew would have known what they were carrying. The owners would have arranged the transport. The buyers would have been waiting at the destination. All of these parties would have had reason to ensure that the ship completed her voyage without incident, that she arrived safely, that her cargo was unloaded and distributed without attracting attention. The idea that such an enterprise would be entrusted to a vessel so poorly maintained that she caught fire and exploded, to a crew so unprepared that they could not respond to a containment failure, to a captain so careless that he allowed his ship to drift helplessly through one of the world's busiest shipping lanes, seems improbable. Smugglers, particularly smugglers of materials as valuable and dangerous as chemical weapons, tend to be careful. They tend to use reliable vessels and reliable crews. They tend not to lose their cargoes to accidents and mishaps that could have been prevented with basic competence. These problems do not disprove the chemical weapons theory. They simply illustrate the difficulty of constructing any coherent explanation for a mystery that may, in the final analysis, have no explanation at all. The theory fits some of the evidence. It contradicts other evidence. It raises questions even as it answers them. This is the nature of the Ourang Medan. Every attempt to explain her fate runs into obstacles, into inconsistencies, into details that refuse to align with any single hypothesis. There are other theories, of course. The legend has inspired decades of speculation, and speculators have proposed explanations ranging from the mundane to the fantastic. Some have suggested that the crew was killed by carbon monoxide poisoning, perhaps from a malfunctioning engine or a poorly ventilated cargo hold. Carbon monoxide is colourless and odourless. It kills without warning, inducing drowsiness and confusion before the victim loses consciousness. A crew exposed to carbon monoxide might have died where they stood, slumping over their workstations, collapsing in corridors and on decks, their death so sudden that no one had time to raise an alarm or attempt escape. This theory has a certain plausibility. Carbon monoxide poisoning is a real and well-documented hazard aboard ships. Engine rooms, in particular, can accumulate dangerous levels of the gas if ventilation fails. The symptoms of carbon monoxide poisoning, headache and dizziness, followed by unconsciousness and death, could explain why no one aboard the Ourang Medan was able to mount an effective response to whatever was killing them. But the theory has weaknesses as well. Carbon monoxide poisoning typically does not cause the expressions of terror described in the legend. Victims of carbon monoxide generally look peaceful, even serene. They die in their sleep, often without ever knowing they are in danger. The contorted faces, the reaching hands, the postures of desperate struggle, all of these details are inconsistent with carbon monoxide as the cause of death. Some have proposed that the crew was poisoned intentionally, that someone aboard the ship, for reasons unknown, introduced a toxic substance into the food or water supply. This theory would explain the simultaneity of the deaths, the lack of external injuries, the apparent surprise with which the crew was overcome. But it raises more questions than it answers. Who would have poisoned the crew, and why? If it was a member of the crew itself, why would he have killed himself along with everyone else? If it was a stowaway or saboteur, where did he go after the deed was done? The theory requires us to imagine a murderer who killed an entire ship's complement and then vanished without a trace, leaving no evidence of his presence, no explanation for his actions, nothing but corpses and mystery. Others have turned to more exotic explanations. Methane eruptions from the seafloor, releasing vast bubbles of gas that could reduce a ship's buoyancy and fill her compartments with an unbreathable atmosphere. Rogue waves that struck the vessel and left the crew dead from impact trauma, their internal injuries invisible beneath intact skin. Sonic weapons, experimental technologies tested in secret, their effects studied on unwitting human subjects far from the oversight of any authority. Disease, some unknown pathogen that spread through the crew with preternatural speed, killing within minutes and leaving the bodies twisted in the throes of fever and delirium. Each of these theories has its proponents. Each has been argued and debated in the forums and publications where such mysteries are dissected. Each offers some explanation for some aspect of the legend, some detail that it illuminates even as it leaves other details in darkness. And none of them can be definitively proven or disproven, because the evidence that would allow us to distinguish between them simply does not exist. We do not know what killed the crew of the Ourang Medan. We do not know that a crew was killed at all. We do not know that the ship existed in any form that corresponds to the legend we have received. What we have instead is a story that has been told and retold, embellished and amended, passed from source to source until its origins have become impossible to trace. a story that captures something essential about human experience, about the fear of the unknown, about the vulnerability we feel when we venture onto the sea, about the secrets that the deep places of the world might keep. The Ourang Medan has become more than a mystery. She has become a myth, a modern legend that speaks to anxieties as old as seafaring itself. The sea has always been a place of terror, long before the first ship was built, before the first human being set foot in the first crude boat. The sea was there, vast and indifferent and unknowable. Early peoples must have looked out at the waves and wondered what lay beyond the horizon, what creatures swam in the depths, what fate awaited those who ventured too far from the safety of the shore. The stories they told, the myths they created reflected these fears. Sea monsters and sirens, whirlpools that swallowed ships whole, lands beyond the edge of the world where the normal rules of existence did not apply. The sea was a boundary, a threshold between the known and the unknown, and to cross it was to risk everything. Modern technology has done much to tame the sea. We have ships that can weather the worst storms. We have navigation systems that can pinpoint a vessel's location anywhere on Earth. We have rescue services and satellite communication and weather forecasting that allows us to anticipate danger before it arrives. The sea is no longer the absolute mystery it once was. We have mapped its depths. We have catalogued its creatures. We have established shipping lanes and traffic control and international agreements that govern how vessels move through its waters. And yet the sea remains strange. It remains vast and powerful and fundamentally alien to human life. We are land creatures. We breathe air. We walk on solid ground. The sea is not our element, and when we venture onto it, we do so at our peril. The great maritime disasters of history remind us of this. The Titanic, the Lusitania, the Empress of Ireland, the Wilhelm Gustloff, ships that sank with thousands aboard, their passengers and crews swallowed by the cold and the dark, their final moments preserved only in the testimony of the few who survived. The sea takes its toll, year after year, century after century. It does not care about our technology or our confidence or our belief that we have mastered its dangers. The Ourang Medan, real or imagined, taps into this primal fear. She is a ship that ventured onto the sea and did not return. She's a crew that faced something terrible and died without ever being able to explain what they had experienced. She's a mystery that has outlived the witnesses and the investigators and everyone who might have been able to tell us what really happened. She is, in a sense, a monument to our ignorance, a reminder that there are things in this world that we do not understand and may never understand, that the sea keeps its secrets well. The boarding party from the Silver Star, if they existed, if they truly climbed aboard that drifting vessel and walked among the dead, must have felt this. They must have felt the weight of the mystery pressing down on them, the silence that filled the ship, the absence of any explanation for the horror they were witnessing. They must have asked themselves the questions that we continue to ask. What happened here? What killed these men? What force or agency or accident transformed a working ship into a death ship? A crew of living men into twisted corpses frozen in their final moments of terror. They had no answers. They found no evidence, no explanation, nothing that would allow them to make sense of what they were seeing. They searched the ship. They examined the bodies. They looked for signs of violence, for evidence of fire or explosion or mechanical failure, and they found nothing. Nothing except the dead and the silence and the heat of the tropical sun beating down on the deck. Nothing except the growing conviction that they needed to leave, that they needed to get away from this ship and whatever curse or contagion or malevolent presence had claimed it. When the fire broke out, when the explosion tore the Ourang Medan apart and sent her to the bottom, it must have seemed almost inevitable. Of course the ship was destroyed. Of course the evidence was lost. Of course the mystery was preserved, sealed forever in the wreckage that sank beneath the waves. This is how mysteries work. This is how legends are born. The truth is always just beyond reach, always hidden behind the next door, always sinking into the darkness before we can grasp it. The Strait of Malacca is quiet tonight. The ships pass through in orderly procession, their lights blinking in the darkness, their courses plotted by computer, their cargoes tracked by database. The chaos of 1947 is long past. The smuggling networks have been disrupted, the warlords have been defeated, the colonial empires have collapsed and been replaced by modern nation-states with customs services and coast guards and all the apparatus of legitimate maritime commerce. The world has changed, the sea has changed, everything has changed, and yet somewhere in the depths, in the sediment of the seafloor or in the sediment of memory, the Ourang Medan waits. She waits with her dead crew, with her unknown cargo, with her unexplained tragedy. She waits for someone to find her, to raise her, to examine her rusted hull and scattered debris, and finally, definitively, answer the questions that have haunted her for more than 7 decades. She waits for the truth to be told. Perhaps the wait will be eternal. Perhaps the wreckage will never be found, or if found, will reveal nothing that we do not already know or suspect. Perhaps the mystery will outlive us all, will be passed down to future generations who will retell the story and speculate about its meaning and never come any closer to understanding what happened in those waters so long ago. Perhaps the Ourang Medan is destined to remain what she has always been, a question without an answer, a ship without a port, a tragedy without a resolution. But perhaps not. Perhaps somewhere, in some archive or attic or forgotten collection, there exists a document that would change everything, a ship's log that records the final voyage, a manifesto that lists the cargo, a letter from a survivor written years later explaining what really happened and why the truth was concealed. Stranger things have been discovered, lost manuscripts, forgotten testimonies, evidence that lay hidden for decades or centuries before chance or diligence brought it to light. The search continues. Researchers in the Netherlands and Indonesia and the United States and elsewhere continue to comb through records, to follow leads, to pursue the tantalizing possibility that the truth is out there waiting to be found. They do not know if they will succeed. They do not know if success is even possible, but they persist, driven by the same impulse that has always driven human beings to investigate the unknown, to seek answers to questions that may have no answers, to push back against the darkness and the silence and the mystery that surrounds us. This is what the Ourang Medan demands of us. Not belief, not skepticism, not certainty in any direction. She demands only that we pay attention, that we ask questions, that we refuse to accept the easy answer that there is no answer. She demands that we remember her, that we speak her name, that we keep the mystery alive even as we search for its resolution. She demands that we acknowledge the sea's power to mystify us, to humble us, to remind us that for all our technology and knowledge and confidence, there are still things in this world that we do not understand. The sea keeps its secrets in layers. The obvious secrets lie near the surface, accessible to anyone with patience and the right equipment. The deeper secrets require more effort, more resources, more time, and the deepest secrets of all, the ones that matter most, are buried so far beneath the sediment of time and circumstance that they may never be recovered, no matter how diligently we search, no matter how desperately we wish to know. The Ourang Medan belongs to this last category. She has become one of those mysteries that defines itself by its resistance to explanation, that grows more compelling precisely because it remains unsolved. And in this resistance, in this stubborn refusal to yield its truth, the case has spawned a secondary phenomenon almost as fascinating as the original tragedy itself. The investigation has become its own story, a tale of false leads and dead ends, of promising discoveries that dissolve upon closer examination, of researchers who devoted years of their lives to a question that may have no answer. Consider the search for the ship's registration. In the immediate aftermath of the incident, assuming there was an incident, this would have been the simplest task imaginable. A ship's name, its port of registry, its ownership, its cargo manifests, its crew lists. All of these details would have been recorded in multiple locations, cross-referenced and verified and maintained according to the bureaucratic requirements that govern maritime commerce. Finding the Ourang Medan should have been as easy as consulting the appropriate registry, sending the appropriate letters, making the appropriate inquiries. The shipping world of 1947, for all its post-war chaos, was not a wilderness without records. It was, in fact, one of the most thoroughly documented industries in human history, precisely because so much depended on knowing exactly where ships were, what they carried, and who was responsible for them. And yet the Ourang Medan appears in no official registry that has ever been discovered. Not in Lloyd's of London, which maintained comprehensive records of the world's merchant vessels. Not in the Dutch colonial administration, which should have had extensive documentation on a vessel operating under its flag in its territorial waters. Not in the records of Singapore or Indonesia or Malaysia, or any of the ports where such a vessel might reasonably have called. The ship exists in story but not in documentation, in memory but not in archives, in the lurid pages of pulp magazines but not in the dry ledgers of maritime bureaucracy. This absence has been interpreted in multiple ways. To the skeptics, it proves that the ship never existed, that the entire story is fabrication from beginning to end. To the believers, it suggests something more sinister, a deliberate erasure, a cover-up so thorough that it extended to the very records that would have confirmed the vessel's existence. To the agnostic investigators, it represents simply another puzzle, another anomaly that must be explained before the larger mystery can be resolved. Perhaps the ship existed under a different name. Perhaps its registration was irregular or informal, as was common in the chaotic post-war shipping trade. Perhaps the records exist somewhere, but have simply not been found, buried in an archive that no one has thought to search or destroyed in one of the many fires and floods and conflicts that have consumed so much documentation over the decades. The search for these records has taken researchers to some unexpected places. The Dutch Maritime Museum in Amsterdam with its vast collections of shipping documents, the National Archives in The Hague, where colonial administration records from the Dutch East Indies have been preserved, the Lloyd's Archive in London, where insurance records and ship registrations going back centuries are maintained, the Bundesarchiv in Germany, where records of wartime shipping and captured vessels might shed light on the Ourang Medan's origins, the National Archives and Records Administration in the United States, where intelligence files from the post-war period might contain references to the incident or its investigation. At each location, researchers have found fragments, tantalizing possibilities, names that almost match, dates that nearly align, circumstances that parallel the story in suggestive ways. But never the definitive proof, never the document that would settle the question once and for all, never the ship's log or crew manifest or cargo declaration that would transform the Ourang Medan from legend into verified historical fact. The mystery preserves itself by yielding just enough to keep the search alive, while withholding the essential details that would resolve it. One particularly intriguing lead emerged in the 1970s, when a researcher in Germany discovered references to a vessel called the Ourang Medan. Note the slight spelling variation, in records related to the disposal of captured German chemical weapons after the war. According to this theory, the ship might have been used to transport confiscated nerve agents or other toxic materials, perhaps as part of an agreement between the Allies and remnants of the Japanese or German military apparatus, perhaps as part of a covert operation that was never officially acknowledged. The chemical weapons angle would explain both the strange deaths and the subsequent secrecy. No government would want to admit its involvement in such dangerous activities, particularly if the operation had ended in disaster and the death of the entire crew. This theory gained additional traction when investigators discovered that the Allies had indeed disposed of large quantities of captured chemical weapons in the years following the war, often through the expedient of dumping them at sea. Ships loaded with artillery shells filled with mustard gas, containers of nerve agents, crates of toxic chemicals, all were taken to designated disposal areas and scuttled, their dangerous cargoes consigned to the depths where, it was hoped, they would remain safely contained forever. The Baltic Sea, the North Atlantic, the Pacific, all became repositories for the toxic legacy of industrial warfare. Could the Ourang Medan have been part of this disposal effort? Could something have gone wrong during transit, the containers leaking or rupturing, exposing the crew to lethal agents that killed them where they stood? The hypothesis is attractive, not least because it provides a rational explanation for the seemingly inexplicable. Chemical exposure can indeed cause rapid death, can leave its victims in contorted postures, can create the kind of horror that witnesses described aboard the Ourang Medan. The cover-up would be entirely consistent with government behaviour in such matters. The reflexive secrecy that surrounds anything related to chemical or biological weapons. The instinct to protect not only specific programs, but the general principle that such programs exist and that accidents can happen. The absence of records would make sense if the records had been deliberately destroyed or classified at the highest levels of security clearance. But the theory founders on a lack of evidence. The Ourang Medan reference, if it ever existed, has never been reliably sourced or verified. The connection to chemical weapons disposal remains speculative, unsupported by any documentary link between the alleged ship and the known disposal operations. The timing does not quite align, the geography does not quite fit, the details do not quite cohere into a convincing narrative. Like so many promising leads in this investigation, the chemical weapons theory offers an elegant solution to the mystery while providing no actual proof that the solution is correct. The pattern repeats itself with other theories. The smuggling hypothesis, attractive though it may be, suffers from the same evidentiary deficit. We can speculate that the Ourang Medan was carrying contraband, that something went wrong, that the crew died as a result, but we cannot prove it. We cannot produce the manifests, the bills of lading, the financial records, the testimony of accomplices or witnesses, the physical evidence that would transform speculation into certainty. The smuggling networks of post-war Southeast Asia are well documented in general terms, but this specific ship, this specific voyage, this specific cargo remains stubbornly absent from the historical record. Similarly with the supernatural explanations, which continue to circulate despite their obvious implausibility. The ghostly presence that some claim haunted the ship, the demonic force that supposedly killed the crew, the cursed cargo that brought destruction to all who touched it, these stories persist in the popular imagination precisely because they cannot be disproven. You cannot prove the negative, cannot demonstrate that ghosts do not exist, or that curses have no power, or that the supernatural played no role in a tragedy for which no natural explanation has been confirmed. The mystery creates space for the impossible, and human imagination rushes to fill that space with the terrors and wonders that rationality cannot accommodate. What is perhaps most remarkable about the Ourang Medan investigation is its persistence across decades. Interest in the case has waxed and waned, naturally enough as other mysteries have captured public attention, and as the years have made the prospect of definitive resolution increasingly remote. But it has never entirely disappeared. Each generation has produced its own researchers, its own investigators, its own enthusiasts who have devoted time and effort to the question. The case has been examined in magazines and newspapers, in books both scholarly and sensational, in documentaries and television programs, in academic papers and online forums. It has been analysed by skeptics determined to debunk it, and believers determined to prove it, by historians seeking context and scientists seeking explanation, by journalists seeking story and enthusiasts seeking truth. This sustained attention has not resolved the mystery, but it has refined our understanding of its dimensions. We know more now about what we do not know. We have mapped the absence, charted the gaps, identified the specific questions that would need to be answered before any theory could be confirmed. The investigation has become a kind of negative archaeology, excavating not artifacts but the spaces where artifacts should be, not evidence but the patterns of missing evidence, not truth but the precise contours of uncertainty. The original sources, or what we might call original sources, have been subjected to increasingly rigorous scrutiny. The Dutch-Indonesian newspaper articles that reportedly carried the first accounts of the incident have been sought in archives and microfilm collections throughout the Netherlands and Indonesia. The results have been frustrating. Some researchers claim to have found references, brief notices that align with the story in its general outlines. Others have searched the same collections and found nothing, no mention of a ghost ship or a mysterious tragedy, or an unknown vessel discovered adrift in the Strait of Malacca. The discrepancy has never been satisfactorily explained. Either some researchers have found evidence that others have missed, or some researchers have misremembered or misreported their findings, or the evidence itself exists in some collections but not others, or the entire documentary foundation of the story is as illusory as the ship itself. The Silver Star, the American vessel that supposedly rescued the surviving crew member and provided the first coherent account of the tragedy, presents similar difficulties. The ship certainly existed, but its logs from the relevant period have proven elusive. Tracking the movements of an individual merchant vessel through the chaos of post-war Pacific shipping requires access to records that may no longer exist or may be scattered across archives in multiple countries. Researchers have traced the Silver Star through port records and shipping news, have reconstructed approximate itineraries and identified possible positions in early 1947, have speculated about whether the ship could have been in the Strait of Malacca at the time the incident supposedly occurred. The results are inconclusive. The ship might have been there, it might not have been. The records do not confirm or deny with sufficient precision to settle the matter. And then there is the question of the SS message itself, the transmission that supposedly first alerted the maritime world to the Ourang Medan's distress. Radio communications in 1947 were monitored by multiple stations, logged by multiple operators, transmitted and retransmitted through networks that should have left documentary traces across the region. A genuine distress call, with its dramatic content and tragic outcome, would almost certainly have been noted somewhere, discussed somewhere, recorded somewhere. Yet the message appears in the story fully formed, quoted verbatim, without any verifiable source, without any attribution to a specific radio station or operator, without any contemporary documentation that would confirm it was ever actually transmitted. The silence of the archives is not conclusive, of course. Records are lost, archives are incomplete, documents are misfiled or destroyed or simply never created. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, as the saying goes, and the failure to find documentation does not prove that the documented events never occurred. The researchers who continue to investigate the Ourang Medan cling to this possibility, the hope that somewhere, in some collection not yet searched, the crucial evidence awaits discovery. A ship's log, a radio transcript, an official report, a letter from a witness, something, anything, that would transform the story from legend into history. Perhaps the most poignant aspect of this ongoing investigation is its human dimension. Behind the speculation about chemical weapons and smuggling operations and supernatural phenomena are real people who may have lived and died in circumstances of unimaginable horror. If the Ourang Medan existed, if the tragedy occurred, then there were men aboard that ship, sailors who left homes and families to earn their livings on the sea, who may have met their ends in terror and agony far from anyone who loved them, whose names have been forgotten and whose bodies were never recovered. The mystery obscures the humanity. The sensational details, the gaping mouths and pointing fingers, the dramatic SOS message and the convenient explosion, all of this makes for compelling narrative but reduces the victims to props in their own tragedy. Figures in a tableau designed to horrify and fascinate rather than to mourn. In the Netherlands, where the ship supposedly registered, there might be families who lost sons and brothers and fathers to the sea in 1947, who received the brief official notification that their loved ones were presumed lost, who never learned what happened or where or why. In Indonesia, where the incident supposedly occurred, there might be descendants of those who witnessed the aftermath, who carried stories passed down through generations that illuminate aspects of the tragedy invisible to foreign researchers. In the maritime communities of Southeast Asia, where the memory of ships and sailors is preserved in ways that official archives cannot capture, there might be fragments of the truth waiting to be gathered and assembled. This is the other search, the one that runs parallel to the documentary investigation, the attempt to find living memory where written records fail. It is a race against time, a desperate effort to locate witnesses or their descendants before the last connections to 1947 are severed forever. An eyewitness to the events, if one survived, would be in their 90s or beyond today. Their children would be elderly, their grandchildren middle-aged, the chain of transmission growing longer and more tenuous with each passing year. Whatever oral history might have circulated in the immediate aftermath of the incident is fading now, dissolving into the general background noise of maritime folklore, becoming indistinguishable from the legends and tall tales that accumulate around any mysterious event. Some investigators have attempted to trace the human connections. They have sought out elderly sailors and former colonial officials, maritime historians and local collectors, anyone who might have heard something from someone who was there or who knew someone who was there. The results, predictably, have been mixed. Stories surface, tantalizing fragments that seem to confirm some aspect of the original account, that add details not found in the published versions, that suggest access to information beyond what has been generally available. But these stories cannot be verified, cannot be traced back to their origins, cannot be distinguished from the embellishments and inventions that naturally accumulate around any good tale in the telling and retelling. One recurring element in these oral accounts is the suggestion that the truth was suppressed, that people who knew what happened were warned or threatened into silence, that the cover-up extended beyond documentary destruction to active intimidation of witnesses. This claim is impossible to evaluate. It has the convenient property of explaining why evidence is scarce, while making that scarcity evidence for the very conspiracy it alleges. If the witnesses were silenced, then of course we cannot find their testimony. If the records were destroyed, then of course we cannot locate documentation. The conspiracy theory creates its own closed loop. interpreting every failure of investigation as confirmation of the investigative target. And yet suppression of inconvenient truths is not unknown in the historical record. Governments do classify information. Corporations do destroy incriminating documents. Witnesses are intimidated. Memories are manipulated. Histories are rewritten to serve the interests of the powerful. The proposition that some agency or organisation might have wished to conceal what happened aboard the Ourang Medan is not inherently implausible, particularly if the cargo was illicit, or the circumstances were embarrassing, or the implications were dangerous. The question is not whether such concealment is possible in principle, but whether it actually occurred in this specific case. And that question leads us back to the same frustrating absence of evidence that characterises every aspect of this investigation. The Ourang Medan has become a test case for the limits of historical knowledge, a demonstration of how completely an event can be lost when the normal mechanisms of documentation fail. We are accustomed to thinking of history as fundamentally recoverable, as preserved in archives and artifacts and memories waiting to be discovered and interpreted. We expect that with sufficient effort, sufficient resources, sufficient ingenuity, we can reconstruct the past in reasonable detail, can answer the questions we pose, can separate truth from legend, fact from speculation. The Ourang Medan suggests otherwise. It suggests that some events may be genuinely unrecoverable, that the past can be lost in ways that no amount of investigation can reverse, that the sea can swallow not only ships and sailors, but the very knowledge of what happened to them. This possibility is disturbing in ways that go beyond the specific mystery at hand. If the Ourang Medan can disappear so completely, what else has vanished without trace? How many tragedies, how many crimes, how many significant events have been erased from history simply because no one recorded them, or because the records were lost, or because the witnesses died before they could tell their stories? The visible past, the past that we study and discuss and incorporate into our understanding of how we came to be where we are, may be only a fraction of what actually occurred, a biased sample distorted by the accidents of preservation and discovery. The darkness that surrounds the Ourang Medan may be the same darkness that surrounds all of history, visible in this case only because we happen to have glimpsed its edges. The ship drifts on, through the decades and the generations, neither confirmed nor refuted, neither found nor finally lost. She has become a permanent resident of that liminal space between history and mythology, between the verifiable and the imagined, between what we know and what we fear. Her crew, real or invented, keeps their silent vigil. Her cargo, whatever it may have been, remains hidden in the depths, or in the imagination, or somewhere in between. The names, if there were names, have been absorbed into the anonymity that the sea imposes on those who disappear within its embrace. We speak of officers and crew, of a captain and a radio operator, but these designations are functions rather than identities, roles rather than individuals. Somewhere, presumably, there were families who waited for word that never came, who marked the passage of time with growing dread before accepting the loss that was never officially confirmed, who mourned without the closure of a body or a grave or even a definitive statement of death. Somewhere, there may have been children who grew up without fathers, wives who aged into widowhood without certainty, parents who outlived sons they never saw buried. These human costs, if the incident occurred, remain entirely invisible to us. The mystery consumes so much attention, generates such fascination with the mechanics of what might have happened, that we rarely pause to consider the lives that may have been extinguished, the individual hopes and fears and relationships that ended in whatever terrible moment overtook the vessel. The crew of the Ourang Medan, should they have existed, deserve to be remembered as more than puzzle pieces, as more than characters in a ghost story, as more than convenient vehicles for our speculation. They deserve to be recognised as human beings who presumably did not choose the fate that found them, who were going about the ordinary work of maritime employment when something extraordinary and terrible intervened. This recognition is impossible to render with specificity because we do not know who they were, but we can at least acknowledge the gap, can note that behind the mystery there may be tragedy, and behind the tragedy there may be grief that we will never be able to comfort or even properly acknowledge. The radio operator, whoever he was, has become the most vivid figure in the narrative, the one character who emerges from the anonymity of the crew with something like individual presence. This is not because we know anything about him as a person, but because his voice, or what is presented as his voice, is the only human utterance we possess from the dying ship. Those fractured messages, that final declaration of personal mortality, give him a reality that his shipmates lack. He was the one who sat at the radio equipment as disaster unfolded, who maintained enough presence of mind to transmit a warning to the outside world, who documented his own death in the act of dying. There is a heroism in this, or at least a commitment to duty, that transcends the uncertainty about whether he actually existed. If he was real, then his final act was an attempt to communicate, to reach beyond the isolation of the doomed vessel and make contact with other human beings, to ensure that someone would know that the fate of the ship would not pass entirely unwitnessed. If he was not real, if he's merely a literary creation, then he represents a profound understanding of what we wish our final moments might contain, a vision of death faced with composure and used for purpose. Either way, he has become the emotional centre of the story, the point at which the abstraction of mysterious death becomes personal and poignant. The other transmission that features in some accounts, the one reportedly received by another vessel and containing the phrase about officers being dead in the chart room, adds another layer of specificity that may or may not correspond to actual events. The chart room would have been the navigational centre of the vessel, the space where course was plotted and position determined, where the officers would have gathered to consult charts and instruments and to make the calculations that guided the ship across the trackless sea. If this location is accurate, if the officers were indeed found in or near the chart room, it might suggest that they were attempting to navigate, to determine position, to take some action in response to whatever crisis was unfolding. Or it might suggest nothing at all, might be a detail invented to provide verisimilitude, to ground the story in the specifics of shipboard geography. The chart room would have been a natural place for a storyteller to locate officers because it was recognisably their domain, the space associated with command and control, with the intellectual work of navigation as opposed to the physical work of the engine room or the deck. Its mention in the account creates an image of death striking at the very centre of the ship's command structure, of whatever killed the crew reaching first or most definitively for those responsible for guiding the vessel. But this image may be entirely imaginary, a product of narrative craft rather than reported fact. The fire that reportedly followed the boarding, that apparently consumed the vessel so completely that nothing could be salvaged and nothing could be examined in detail, adds a third mystery to the mystery of the deaths and the mystery of the cargo. Fire at sea is always dangerous, always dramatic, but the specific nature of this fire, as it appears in the various accounts, suggests something beyond ordinary combustion. The ship is described as exploding rather than simply burning, as being destroyed with a violence and completeness that normal shipboard fires rarely achieve. This description implies an accelerant, something aboard that could convert fire into explosion, that could provide the energy for rapid and total destruction. The timing is also suspicious in some tellings, with the fire beginning shortly after the rescue party returns to their own vessel, as if the ship was waiting to destroy itself until witnesses had departed, as if it was determined to preserve its secrets by obliterating the evidence that might have revealed them. This timing creates a narrative of deliberate concealment, of a cover-up accomplished not through document destruction or witness intimidation, but through the more fundamental method of eliminating the crime scene itself. Whether this reflects what actually happened or what storytellers wanted to have happened is impossible to determine, but the effect is to foreclose investigation at the very moment when investigation might have begun, to ensure that whatever might have been learned from examining the vessel in detail would never be learned. The rescue vessel itself presents interesting questions that are rarely pursued. The ship typically identified as the Silver Star would have had a crew of its own, officers and sailors who participated in the discovery and the attempted rescue, and who witnessed the fire or explosion that ended the Ourang Medan. These witnesses presumably returned to port and went about their lives, and one might expect that at least some of them would have spoken of their experience, would have provided accounts that could be traced and verified. The silence of these witnesses is as complete as the silence of the Ourang Medan crew, albeit differently interpreted. Perhaps they were intimidated into silence, as the conspiracy theories suggest. Perhaps they simply did not consider the incident worth discussing or documenting in ways that would survive. Perhaps they left accounts that have been lost in the normal attrition of historical records. Or perhaps they did not exist because the rescue never happened, because the Silver Star was not where the story places it, and did not encounter the vessel, and did not witness the events that the story describes. Each interpretation leads to a different conclusion about what we are dealing with when we engage with this story, but none of these interpretations can be tested against evidence because the evidence is precisely what is missing. The location of the incident, typically given as somewhere in the Strait of Malacca, places it in one of the busiest shipping lanes in the world, a narrow channel between the Malay Peninsula and the island of Sumatra, through which a significant proportion of global maritime traffic passes. This location makes the complete absence of corroborating evidence somewhat more surprising, or somewhat more suspicious, depending on one's interpretive framework. A vessel in distress in such well-travelled waters might be expected to attract attention, to be spotted by other ships, to generate some record beyond the single encounter that the story relates. The fact that only one ship apparently responded to the distress signals, that only one ship apparently observed the condition of the Ourang Medan, that the fire or explosion was apparently witnessed by only this single vessel, strains credulity somewhat. In busy waters, distress calls are typically heard by multiple listeners, and the drama of a burning ship typically attracts observers from whatever vessels happen to be in the area. The solitude of the Silver Star in this account, if accurate, would itself require explanation. Were other ships in the area unaware of the distress calls? Did they fail to respond for some reason? Did they observe the incident but choose not to report what they saw? The questions multiply without approaching answers, and each answer that is offered raises new questions in its turn. The period immediately following the end of World War II provides context that shapes many interpretations of the Ourang Medan incident. The years between 1945 and 1950 were a time of transition and chaos in Southeast Asia, as colonial powers attempted to reassert control over territories occupied by Japan during the war, as independence movements challenged those colonial powers, as new nations emerged from the wreckage of empire. The Dutch East Indies, which would become Indonesia, was in the midst of a violent struggle for independence, with the Netherlands attempting to maintain control against nationalist forces backed by significant portions of the population. This political context created conditions in which illicit activities might flourish, in which the normal mechanisms of documentation and oversight might break down, in which ships might carry cargoes that no one wished to have examined too closely. The suggestion that the Ourang Medan was transporting chemical weapons left over from the Japanese occupation, or nerve agents being smuggled to interested parties, or other dangerous materials that required concealment, gains a certain plausibility from this historical background. The chaos of the period, the opportunities for profit in the movement of restricted materials, the desire of various parties to acquire weapons or dispose of them or both, created an environment in which such transactions were not merely possible, but likely. The chemical hypothesis remains perhaps the most coherent attempt to explain the deaths that the story describes. Exposure to certain toxic substances can produce rapid incapacitation and death, while leaving bodies superficially undamaged, can spread through a vessel as gases escape from compromised containers or are released by chemical reactions accelerated by the tropical heat. The positions of the bodies, if accurately reported, might be consistent with people overcome suddenly while going about their duties, falling where they stood or sat or lay without time to seek help or shelter. The facial expressions, often described as frozen in terror or pain, might reflect the physiological effects of certain toxins rather than psychological states, might be symptoms rather than emotions. The death of the ship's dog, mentioned in some accounts, might indicate a toxic environment throughout the vessel, rather than a human-targeting pathogen or weapon. The fire that destroyed the ship might have been triggered by the same chemicals that killed the crew, by reactions that produced enough heat to ignite combustible materials, by the instability inherent in certain classes of hazardous substances. This hypothesis has the virtue of internal consistency, of connecting the various elements of the story in a way that makes physical and chemical sense, but it cannot be tested because there is no wreckage to examine, no bodies to autopsy, no cargo manifest to analyse, no survivors to interrogate. The alternative hypotheses shade from the plausible into the fantastic, from natural phenomena that science can accommodate to suggestions that strain the boundaries of what most people consider possible. Carbon dioxide released from the seafloor, which has been blamed for other mysterious maritime incidents, could theoretically create conditions similar to those described, displacing the oxygen in a ship's atmosphere and suffocating everyone aboard without leaving visible marks of violence. This phenomenon is known to occur in volcanic areas, and in regions where underwater seepage of gases creates local hazards, but its occurrence in the Strait of Malacca at the time and place indicated by the story would require specific geological conditions that have not been identified. Other natural explanations include freak weather events, unusual wave formations, equipment failures that release toxic fumes from the ship's own machinery, contaminated water or food supplies that poisoned the crew simultaneously. Each of these explanations has proponents, each has weaknesses, and none can be definitively evaluated without evidence that does not exist. Beyond the natural explanations lie the more exotic possibilities, the theories that draw on supernatural or extraterrestrial or conspiratorial frameworks to account for the mystery. The Ourang Medan has been adopted into the literature of unexplained phenomena, classified alongside other mysterious ships and vanished crews and events that resist conventional explanation. In this context, she becomes evidence for forces beyond human understanding, for interventions by entities or powers that operate outside the boundaries of known science. These interpretations cannot be refuted because they do not rely on the kind of evidence that scientific inquiry requires, but neither can they be confirmed, and they carry the epistemological burden of invoking explanations that themselves require more explanation than the phenomena they purport to address. To say that aliens killed the crew of the Ourang Medan is not to explain the deaths, but to replace one mystery with a larger mystery, to answer a question with a more profound question, to substitute the unknown for the merely uncertain. The persistence of the story through decades of skeptical examination suggests that it addresses needs or interests that go beyond the desire for factual accuracy. People return to the Ourang Medan not because they expect to find the answer to what happened, but because the mystery itself provides something valuable, satisfies some hunger that facts alone cannot appease. This function of mystery, this service that the unexplained performs in human consciousness, may be as important as whatever actually occurred in the waters of the Strait of Malacca. We need stories that remind us of the limits of our knowledge, that challenge our confidence in the comprehensibility of the world, that leave room for wonder and for dread. The Ourang Medan provides this service whether she was real or imagined, whether her crew died in agony or never existed to die, whether the mystery reflects actual events or merely human creativity applied to the infinite suggestiveness of the sea. The sea itself remains the ultimate context for understanding this story and stories like it. Whatever humans do upon its surface, whatever cargoes they carry, whatever fates they meet, the sea incorporates into its own vast indifference. It does not remember the ships that have crossed it, does not mourn the sailors it has swallowed, does not preserve the evidence of what has occurred within its domain. The Ourang Medan, if she existed and burned and sank, lies somewhere beneath that surface, her structure long since consumed by salt and pressure and time, her secrets merged with the accumulated sediment of millions of years. The bodies, if there were bodies, have returned to the elemental from which all life emerged, their organic matter recycled through the marine food web, their bones dissolved by the patient chemistry of salt water. Nothing physical remains to be discovered, no wreckage waiting for the deep-sea explorer's light, no artifacts preserved in the cold and darkness of the ocean floor. The ship has become pure story, pure question, an artifact of narrative rather than metal and wood. This transformation from physical object to narrative object is perhaps the most interesting aspect of the Ourang Medan phenomenon. All shipwrecks become stories eventually, as the physical evidence degrades and the witnesses die, and only the accounts remain, but most wrecks retain some anchor in the material world, some verifiable location, or recovered artifact or documented record that connects the story to historical reality. The Ourang Medan has lost even this anchor, if she ever possessed it, and exists now entirely in the realm of telling and retelling, of text and interpretation, of claim and counterclaim. She has achieved a kind of immortality through this transformation, a permanence that physical existence could never provide. Ships that can be located can be explored and documented and explained, can be reduced to the prosaic reality of broken steel and scattered debris, can have their mysteries solved and their stories concluded. Ships that cannot be located, that exist only in the uncertain space between history and legend, can never be thus reduced, can never have their stories concluded, can go on generating wonder and speculation indefinitely. The Ourang Medan has become, in this sense, a perfect mystery. a question that preserves itself by preventing any possible answer. Every investigation fails because there is nothing to investigate. Every explanation remains tentative because there are no facts against which to test it. Every skeptic who demonstrates the weakness of the evidence confronts the counterargument that the evidence was deliberately destroyed. And every believer who asserts the reality of the incident confronts the counterargument that belief without evidence is mere credulity. The debate cannot be resolved because the conditions for resolution do not exist, and this irresolvability is precisely what keeps the story alive, what ensures that new generations will encounter it and be captured by it, and add their own speculations to the accumulating interpretive tradition. The human need for closure, for narrative completion, for answers to the questions that trouble us, crashes against the Ourang Medan like waves against an immovable rock. We want to know what happened. We want the mystery solved, the deaths explained, the cargo identified, the conspiracy unmasked, the truth revealed. We want the satisfaction of understanding, the comfort of comprehension, the reassurance that comes from knowing that even terrible events can be made sense of, can be incorporated into our understanding of how the world works. The Ourang Medan denies us this satisfaction, refuses to yield to our demands, maintains its silence against all interrogation. In doing so, it reminds us that not all questions have answers, that not all stories have endings, that some mysteries may persist forever, unresolved, unexplained, unsolved. And perhaps this is the gift the Ourang Medan offers, wrapped in its shroud of impossibility and contradiction. Not an answer, but an education in the limits of knowing. Not a solution, but a confrontation with the irreducible uncertainty that underlies even our most confident assertions about the past. We imagine history as a recoverable sequence of events, a chain of causes and effects that, given sufficient evidence and sufficient effort, can be reconstructed in its entirety. We tell ourselves that the past is fixed, stable, knowable, that it exists in some objective form beyond our interpretations of it, waiting to be discovered like a continent beneath the fog. The Ourang Medan suggests otherwise. It suggests that the past, or at least large portions of it, may be as inaccessible as the future, as uncertain as the present moment in which we struggle to understand what is happening even as it happens. The ship, real or imagined, has become a mirror in which we see reflected our own epistemological anxieties, our own doubts about the reliability of knowledge, our own suspicions that the world may be stranger and more resistant to understanding than we like to believe. The final transmission, those desperate words reaching across the water to anyone who might be listening, carries a weight that transcends the question of their authenticity. All officers, including captain, are dead lying in chart room and bridge, possibly whole crew dead. The voice emerging from the radio static speaking these words, whether in 1947 or 1948 or never, becomes a voice speaking for all those who have faced incomprehensible catastrophe and tried, in their final moments, to communicate what was happening to them. The inadequacy of language to capture extreme experience, the gulf between the word and the thing it names, the failure of communication at precisely the moment when communication matters most. These themes resonate through the alleged transmission like harmonics through a struck bell. I die. 2 words, the simplest possible statement of mortality, the most fundamental fact of human existence compressed into a single breath. No explanation, no farewell, no plea for help, just the bare acknowledgement that a life is ending, that consciousness is extinguishing, that the speaker is passing from the realm of the living to whatever lies beyond. Whether anyone actually spoke these words, whether they were received by anyone, whether they meant what we imagine them to mean, the words themselves have achieved a kind of autonomous existence, circulating through the decades, touching reader after reader with their stark finality, their terrible simplicity, their refusal to elaborate or explain. The frozen faces of the dead, those expressions of terror preserved in the tropical heat until the boarding party found them, speak to something deep in the human imagination. We know, rationally, that dead bodies do not truly preserve the final emotions of the dying, that rigor mortis and the processes of decomposition reshape facial features according to biological rather than psychological principles, that the expression we read on a corpse's face is largely a projection of our own expectations and fears. Yet the image persists, the face locked in a scream that no one heard, the eyes staring at something no living person can perceive, the mouth open as if still trying to warn or plead or curse. This image connects the Ourang Medan to a vast tradition of ghost stories and horror tales, in which the dead bear witness to their own deaths, in which the body becomes a text recording the circumstances of its destruction. The ancient Greeks believed that murder victims' wounds would bleed in the presence of their killers, that the dead could thus identify those responsible for their deaths. The corpses of the Ourang Medan, in the traditional telling, perform a similar function, their frozen terror pointing towards some terrible presence, some overwhelming threat, some force capable of killing dozens of men in an instant while leaving their bodies unmarked. The fact that no such force is ever identified, that the terror frozen on those faces points toward nothing we can name or understand, only amplifies the horror. Better, in some ways, a monster that can be named and confronted than an unknown that cannot even be described. The dog, that loyal hound frozen in the act of attacking an enemy it could never reach, adds a note of pathos to the horror. Animals, in our imagination, possess an innocence that humans have forfeited, a simplicity of being that we both envy and condescend to. The dog died defending its masters, or trying to, and its failure compounds the mystery of what could have overwhelmed all defences, all resistance, all instinctive will to survive. Dogs have accompanied sailors for as long as there have been sailors, serving as rat catchers and companions and early warning systems for dangers that human senses might miss. A dog that could sense approaching storms, that would bark at the presence of strangers, that would warn of fire or flooding, such a creature was valuable beyond its practical functions, embodying a kind of protective vigilance that sailors far from home and help found deeply reassuring. The Ourang Medan's dog failed in this protective function, or rather succeeded only in dying alongside those it sought to protect. Whatever killed the crew killed the dog as well. Whatever horror swept the ship made no distinction between human and animal, sophisticated consciousness and simple instinct. The dog frozen mid-snarl becomes an emblem of futility, of courage that was not enough, of loyalty that could not save. The boiler that exploded, sinking the ship before any thorough investigation could be conducted, has the quality of narrative inevitability that real events rarely possess. In fiction, such a convenient destruction of evidence would be recognised as a plot device, a mechanism for preserving mystery, when too much explanation would diminish the story's power. In reality, boilers do explode, and damaged ships do sink, and evidence is lost all the time through accident and negligence, and the simple passage of time. Yet the timing feels almost too perfect, the explosion occurring at precisely the moment when rescue seemed possible, when the mystery might have been solved, when the cargo might have been examined, and the bodies autopsied, and the truth extracted from the physical evidence. This perfection of timing argues simultaneously for and against the story's authenticity. On one hand, it suggests the narrative shaping of a storyteller rather than the messiness of actual events. On the other, reality occasionally produces coincidences that fiction would reject as too implausible, too neat, too obviously meaningful. Perhaps the Ourang Medan's boiler did explode at that critical moment, not through any cosmic design, but through the accumulated damage of whatever catastrophe had already struck the ship, through fires started by the mystery force, through structural failures triggered by the violent deaths. Or perhaps the explosion is an invention, a narrative tool added to the story to explain the absence of physical evidence, to protect the mystery from the prosaic reality that no such ship ever existed to explode. Both explanations are possible. Neither can be verified or refuted. The explosion, like everything else about the Ourang Medan, exists in a state of permanent indeterminacy. Consider for a moment what it would mean if the story were entirely true. If, in February of 1948, a Dutch freighter did send distress signals from somewhere in the Straits of Malacca, and an American vessel did respond, and the boarding party did find what the stories describe, and the ship did explode and sink before the mystery could be solved. What would this tell us about the world? It would tell us that there exists, or existed, some force capable of killing dozens of men almost simultaneously, while leaving no visible injuries. It would tell us that this force could strike without warning in one of the world's busiest shipping lanes, aboard a vessel in good working order, in broad daylight. It would tell us that the governments and navies of multiple nations either investigated this force and concealed their findings, or failed to investigate at all, leaving one of the most dramatic mass deaths in maritime history unexplained and largely ignored. It would tell us that our understanding of what is possible, of what forces can act in the physical world, is incomplete in fundamental ways. It would suggest that we move through an environment containing dangers we cannot perceive or predict, that death can come from directions we have not imagined, that the universe is stranger and more threatening than our comfortable assumptions allow. This is, perhaps, why the story persists despite its evident problems. It articulates a fear that evidence cannot extinguish, a suspicion that the world is more dangerous than we know. Now consider what it would mean if the story were entirely false. If there was no Ourang Medan, no distress call, no boarding party, no frozen dead, no explosion. If the entire narrative is a construction, assembled from fragments of maritime lore and wartime anxiety, and the eternal human appetite for mystery, what would this tell us about ourselves? It would tell us that we create the monsters we need, that we populate the unknown spaces of our maps with creatures born from our own fears and desires. It would tell us that a good story, well told, can achieve a kind of reality that facts and evidence cannot touch, can enter the cultural imagination and take up permanent residence there, can become more true than truth, because it speaks to needs that mere accuracy cannot satisfy. It would tell us that the line between history and mythology is more porous than we like to admit, that the past is as much a creation of the present as a record of what actually occurred, that we are all engaged, always, in the collaborative project of constructing the reality we inhabit. This too is a kind of knowledge, perhaps a more important kind than the simple determination of what did or did not happen on a ship in the Straits of Malacca 7 decades ago. The witnesses, if there were witnesses, have long since passed from the world, taking whatever first-hand knowledge they possessed into the silence that awaits us all. The radio operators who supposedly received the distress call, the sailors who allegedly boarded the stricken vessel, the officials who may have investigated and covered up the incident, all these figures have joined the crew they supposedly discovered, have become as silent and inaccessible as those frozen bodies in the chart room. Even if names could be attached to these witnesses, even if living relatives could be located and interviewed, even if documents existed proving their involvement, the passage of time would have transformed their memories into unreliable constructions, part recall and part imagination, and part the accumulated weight of everything they had heard and read about the incident in the intervening years. Human memory is not a recording device faithfully preserving experience for later retrieval. It is a creative process, constantly revising and reconstructing, filling gaps with plausible inventions, adjusting details to fit preferred narratives, updating the past to match the demands of the present. The witnesses to the Ourang Medan, even if they existed, could not tell us what actually happened. They could only tell us what they believed had happened, what they had convinced themselves had happened, what their memories had gradually shaped into a coherent story capable of being communicated to others. This is not a failure specific to the Ourang Medan case. It is the fundamental condition of all historical knowledge. We access the past through the mediation of human consciousness, with all its limitations and distortions, and we can never be certain that what we recover bears any reliable relationship to what actually occurred. The sea keeps its secrets because it has no memory, no intention, no purpose that we can discern. It does not care whether ships cross safely or founder, whether sailors live or die, whether mysteries are solved or persist forever. This indifference is both terrifying and, in a strange way, liberating. Terrifying because it reminds us of our insignificance, our vulnerability, our ultimate helplessness before forces we cannot control. Liberating because it frees us from the burden of cosmic significance, releases us from the suspicion that the universe is watching and judging and keeping score. The Ourang Medan sailed into this indifference and was absorbed by it, became part of the vast anonymous archive of things that happened and were forgotten, events that occurred without meaning or purpose or lesson, just the endless unfolding of physical processes according to physical laws. Or the Ourang Medan never sailed at all, was always just a story, a pattern of words and images circulating through human culture, acquiring depth and detail with each retelling, evolving to survive in the ecology of narratives that compete for our attention and memory. Either way, the ship has achieved a kind of permanence that transcends the physical, a persistence in human consciousness that outlasts the brief existence of any actual vessel. Steel rusts and wood rots and bone dissolves, but stories can go on forever, passed from teller to teller, generation to generation, each retelling adding a little, changing a little, adapting the narrative to new circumstances and new audiences while preserving its essential power to frighten and fascinate and wonder. The tropical night falls quickly in those latitudes, the sun dropping toward the horizon and then vanishing with almost unseemly haste, plunging the world from day to darkness in a matter of minutes. The ship, wherever it was or was not, would have made this transition many times, the crew watching the brief tropical twilight give way to star-filled blackness, the constellations of the southern hemisphere wheeling overhead in their nightly dance. Orion rising, the Southern Cross turning on its axis, the Milky Way blazing across the sky with a brilliance that modern city dwellers can barely imagine. The sailors would have known these stars, would have navigated by them, would have felt the ancient connection between earthbound humanity and the cosmic order of which we are a part. On their final night, if they had a final night, did they look up at those familiar patterns and find comfort, or had some premonition of disaster already infected their thoughts, turning even the stars into omens of approaching doom? We cannot know. We will never know. The distance between their experience and our imagination of it is unbridgeable, absolute, final. What remains is the question itself, hovering over the empty water like a ghost, like the signal that supposedly reached across the distance to summon help that arrived too late. What happened to the Ourang Medan? The question has no answer because the ship has no definite existence, because the events have no verified occurrence, because the evidence has no recoverable form. Yet the question persists, generating speculation and investigation and imaginative reconstruction, refusing to be silenced by the absence of answers. Perhaps this persistence is the real phenomenon, more interesting than any supposed chemical cargo or supernatural intervention. The human mind, confronted with an unresolvable mystery, does not simply abandon the inquiry and move on. It returns, compulsively, obsessively, circling the question like a moth around a flame, unable to reach the centre, unable to fly away. We are creatures designed for understanding, evolved for pattern recognition and causal inference, and we experience the absence of explanation as a kind of wound, an incompleteness that demands healing. The Ourang Medan exploits this cognitive need, offers the wound without the healing, the mystery without the solution, the question without the answer, and so the story continues, decade after decade, finding new audiences, generating new theories, refusing to be forgotten despite all the reasons it should fade into obscurity. Each telling adds something, subtracts something, adapts the narrative to contemporary concerns and interests. The chemical warfare theory gains adherents in eras of anxiety about weapons of mass destruction. The paranormal theories flourish when interest in the supernatural is high. The skeptical debunking finds its audience among those who pride themselves on rationality and resistance to superstition. The story is flexible enough to accommodate all these interpretations, capacious enough to serve all these purposes, empty enough at its centre to be filled with whatever content we need to pour into it. It is less a historical event than a cultural artifact, a framework for exploring ideas about death and the sea and the unknown and the limits of knowledge. The Ourang Medan is whatever we make of it, and we have made of it a repository for our deepest fears and strangest speculations, a vessel that carries not cargo but meaning across the decades, a ship of the dead that sails forever through the waters of human imagination. The final Morse characters, that single letter that may have been a dying hand's last act or a storyteller's dramatic flourish, fall into silence. I die, and then nothing, only the static hiss of empty frequencies, the white noise of the cosmos going about its business, indifferent to the small drama that may or may not have concluded aboard a Dutch freighter, somewhere in the warm waters between Sumatra and Malaya. The radio operator who allegedly received those words would have waited, perhaps, listening for more, hoping for a correction or clarification, some additional information that would make sense of what he had heard. But no more words came. The transmission ended definitively with that bald announcement of mortality, that statement of the one fact that no one can dispute, the one certainty in a universe of uncertainties. We all die. The crew of the Ourang Medan died, if they existed. The storytellers who invented them died, if invention is what occurred. The investigators who tried to separate truth from fiction have largely died. The readers who encountered the story in musty magazines and second-hand books have died. And yet the story survives, passing from dying to dying, from ending to ending, carrying its cargo of mystery and horror and wonder across the years, across the generations, across the threshold that separates what happened from what we remember, what was from what we believe. Standing at the ship's rail, looking out over water that may or may not have witnessed these events, one feels the vertigo of historical uncertainty, the dizzying awareness that the past is a country we can never visit, only imagine. The sun beats down, the waves roll past, the shipping lanes carry their endless traffic of cargo and commerce and human purpose. Somewhere beneath this surface, perhaps, the remains of the Ourang Medan lie scattered, unrecognisable, incorporated into the geology of the seafloor. Or nowhere beneath this surface lies any such thing, and the ship exists only in the telling, only in the words and images that have accumulated around its name like coral around a reef. Either way, the mystery persists, the questions remain, the story goes on. Some things we will never know, some questions will never be answered. Some ships sail beyond the horizon of history and never return. The Ourang Medan, real or imagined, has made this voyage, has crossed from the world of fact into the world of legend, and from there into some strange territory beyond either, where truth and fiction blend so thoroughly that the distinction ceases to matter. What happened aboard that vessel? What killed the crew? What silenced the radio operator mid-transmission? The questions echo across the decades, across the water, across the boundary between what can be known and what must forever remain uncertain. They find no answers. They will find no answers. And in their unanswered persistence they achieve a kind of immortality, a permanence that no answer could provide. The mystery of the Ourang Medan endures precisely because it cannot be solved, and in that endurance it becomes something more than a maritime curiosity, more than a ghost story, more than a historical puzzle. It becomes a meditation on the nature of knowledge itself, on the limits of what we can discover and understand, on the vast dark ocean of the unknown that surrounds the small bright island of what we think we know. The signal fades, the static hisses, the ship sails on, through fog and darkness, toward a destination no chart can locate, carrying its cargo of the dead and the impossible toward whatever harbour waits at the end of mystery. We will not follow. We cannot follow. We can only stand here, on the shore of the knowable, and watch it disappear and wonder.